Good morning and welcome to this second day of the EU-Africa Week organized by the S&D Group in the European Parliament. Today we're going to be talking about the challenges and opportunities that the digital revolution brings into the economy and how can both European and African countries shape those changes to make sure that they give a boost to their economies. Now, Africa is one of the least connected continents in the world, with only 39% of its population having access to internet, whereas actually the opportunities for the economic growth of the continent are enormous. We're talking about a potential 200 billion euros into the economy if we actually make sure that we mainstream access to internet. That can give a lot of boost in terms of creation of employment, new companies, new economy that can make sure that we continue further developing the continent. And the EU is contributing to that through its economic policies in partnership with Africa, because one of the objectives is to boost this digital transformation. We're going to be talking about that from the perspective of the business organizations, but also from the governmental perspective here in Europe. And I have an amazing lineup of speakers to do that today. But before we dig into the conversation, I am very much happy to have with us today Mr. René Tames, who is a former Estonian Minister of Entrepreneurship and Information and Technology. And as you know, Estonia is one of the leading countries in the digital transformation in Europe. So I'm very much welcome to have him here and to hear from your own experience in Estonia.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. My country is often called e-Estonia, and that's for a very good reason, because we rely a lot on digital technologies. And since regaining our independence in 1991, we had to reboot our economy to become more efficient and innovative. Just let me give you a glimpse what it means to be e-Estonian. So practically all public services in Estonia are accessible online, except for getting married and divorced. For instance, if you are an entrepreneur, then it takes just 2-3 hours to set up a company, and all the later reporting, tax declaration filings, etc. can be done online. Filling up your tax form takes 2 or 3 minutes. Since 2005, we have enjoyed the opportunity to cast our votes electronically, and roughly half of the voters in recent local elections did so. We have a digital health and digital prescription system, which is very convenient for our citizens. And I can continue and continue. And these are not just flashy gadgets, but they have a real-life impact on our lives and economy. Just by authenticating ourselves and signing documents with electronic ID, we save each year 2% of our GDP. Also, our public service is more leaner, more transparent, more efficient, and we get more bang for the buck. ICT sector has grown immensely because all these services have been developed in cooperation with our private sector. And 6.5% of the workforce is now employed in this sector. Estonia is also known as a country of unicorns. It means that we have a very vibrant startup ecosystem. Today we have 8 companies worth more than $1 billion, and the number is expected to triple in a few years. And in turn, this has created a kind of cycle where founders who have become successful are investing into new generation of founders and companies. And of course, we have paid lots of attention on equal opportunities, on opportunities for everybody, and generation gaps, and we can discuss this later. 4 lessons that I wanted to draw from our experiences, perhaps which are worth of sharing. First, I would like to point out that the basis of these changes has been political will, leadership from both private and public sector, and perhaps this is one of the key takeaways from my point of view. Robust infrastructure is another, which is important. Estonia, since regaining its independence, was dirt poor, poorer than a number of African countries today. And first investments that were done were into broadband connections of schools and public libraries, also purchasing computers that were accessible for everybody, and then rolling out throughout the country basic ICT skills courses. Important parts of the infrastructure are also electronic ID, which is compulsory. We all have personal identification codes, and also open data sharing platform X-Road, to which all the public and private services are connected to. And we don't have centralized databases nor centralized service providers. And this decentralization approach provides us greater cybersecurity. Next, what I would like to point out is people have to trust their data to the government. And this means that we have to have strong cyber defenses, but also strong protection of personal data, both from the regulation side, but also from the implementation side. And we have a principle that each citizen owns its data and has right to ask the questions who is looking at the data. And fourth, technological experimentation. Estonia has been one of the early adopters of key technologies such as blockchain, even before the term blockchain was invented. And today we are paying lots of attention on implementation of machine learning and AI in public services, and we have more than 100 use cases. So I'm very happy to share our knowledge, and as a country, we are doing that by visiting many of the countries, and our companies are also in many of the African countries helping to build up the digital societies there. Estonia is also part of Team Europe effort and Digital for Development Hub, and with a particular focus on Africa. So thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you so much. I think you point to many of the issues that we wanted to discuss, the importance of the private-public partnership to make sure that investment keep on flowing to those companies, the importance of having the infrastructure that actually allows those companies to grow, the importance of education, because you need to have skilled workers that can actually be present in those companies. All those challenges are indeed shared by many, many countries, not only in Europe, but also in Africa. And of course, this question of the trust, the cybersecurity issues, the question of how do we protect users when we see a change in the way that we use the internet, we're going to be talking about all those issues with our speakers today, because they're absolutely key to this conversation. But before that, I'm going to present today my speakers, and I want to give them the floor to have a short introduction about where their view is in those challenges and opportunities that the digital transformation can bring in economy in Europe and in Africa. And for that, I'd like to welcome Ms. Kokeyo Eselva, who is joining us from Kenya. She's the founder and the CEO of Vioto 21, which is a public relation and marketing organization. We're going to be joined as well by Dr. Prince Oguwo, who is the co-founder of African Innovation Hub and Creative Economic Fellow at the World Intellectual Property Organization. And we have with us here today Mr. Alan Nkyurikiye, who is the founder and the CEO of Wojensi, which is an investment booster company, and we'll be talking about that role because investment is absolutely key for the digital transformation. And we also have the member of the European Parliament from the S&D and co-president of the ASAP EU Joint Parliament Assembly, Mr. Canyo Sorinho, who is here with us as well. So I'm going to go back to Kenya because I want to be joined by Ms. Eselva. I was wondering, from your own perspective, working in a company that is helping companies shape their presence online, what do you think are the main challenges? Okay, we have a technical problem, so we are going to move into the next speakers. So we have Dr. Oguwo, who is joining us today as well. I was wondering, from the perspective of someone who's trying to help companies to to jump on that wave of the digital transformation, what are for you the main challenges, but also opportunities that companies in Africa are facing?
Key challenges companies are facing, just from my discussion with the entrepreneurs I've been able to work with, are often around things like infrastructure and things like governance issues. So what we find working on the ground is that governance, for example, is a significant issue because the laws are often not very clear, and this makes it very difficult to operate both within countries and to scale across countries in Africa. And for digital products, this is often a very big issue because scalability is often integral to their business models. Um, and then you have issues with infrastructure. So what we often find is within the very big cities, you usually have adequate broadband, and you often usually have easier access to data plans. So data plans tend to be less expensive relative to the income levels of people living in those cities. But in rural areas, this is quite often not the case. I mean, estimates are as high as 900 million people on the continent not having access to the internet. And so this remains another critical issue for digital companies trying to scale in Africa.
Of course. I want to apologize to our viewers today because we don't have video connection with our speakers. And so you're going to be seeing us during the whole conversation, but I think that's okay. Thank you so much for that contribution, because indeed, this is something that we were discussing before starting the event today here with Mr. Nkurike about this issue of the need for governance, right? To have a common, harmonized legislation when it comes to all these different issues to make sure that we bring certainty for the investors. So I was wondering, from your perspective, trying to bring funding into those companies that are evolving in Africa, what are the main challenges and opportunities that you see in the digital transformation?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So for me, I will start with the opportunities. So what I see mostly when I go to Africa, I see opportunities in terms of businesses. So as we started from the beginning, digitalization is bringing many opportunities. And then the opportunities that I see is just opportunities that are not being taken by the entrepreneurs. So I don't see many innovations. So I can see some entrepreneurs trying to do something in the digital space, but really, I won't say breakthrough innovations, but that's some innovations that can help our population. That's most of the time what is lacking. And then so what we try to do in that space then is trying to help entrepreneurs. We start with what we call a venture studio, where we help entrepreneurs to come up with innovative ideas that can solve their own problems using digital. So that's how we start. So that's the opportunity. So we identify opportunities, let's say in the health sector as an example, what can we do with the digital? So then we identify a solution. That's how we start. And then what then is missing in most African countries is funding to what we call seed funding, grant funding to pilot to see if that project is worth doing. So then that's when we come in. We are an equity crowdfunding platform. So we connect entrepreneurs in Africa to the diaspora investors through our online investment platform. So then those business ideas that we think they have a potential to grow, then we connect them to diaspora angel investors in Europe. They can buy some shares in those companies, and then we provide them the seed funding. So then the seed funding is really to help them then to just to get what we call customer market fit. So do you have an idea? You go to market, you see there is a business model around that. And then, so for us, that's when we leave. So then we let you then, find a private equity investor, someone who will give you more money, then, that's how you will grow. So that's really when it comes to opportunities, that's what we see. We can build more companies in that way. So then when it comes to challenges, for me, I would just tell you one, when it comes to, so our platform is in Europe. So we work with diaspora who are in Europe, investing in companies in Africa. So we have a lot of issue when it comes, what we call KYC, knowing your customers. So when we have an entrepreneur from Africa raising money from European investors, so our banks issues. So who are those entrepreneurs? So so we have those issues about KYC. So how do we trust entrepreneurs in Africa. So all this, so you know about this KYC. So that's one of the biggest challenge for us when we try to invest on the continent. And then other issues are really, I won't talk about technological issues because we all know them. So the broadband, so we all talked about it. For me, I will talk about all these really just legal issues. So for us, when we invest in a country, let's say Ghana, so we have issues on double taxation. So for first of all, for our investors here, and then also for our entrepreneurs in those countries. So that registration around, startup, as an example, digital companies, how do we reduce the barriers to do business in those countries? So when it comes to digital businesses. So for me, I would say opportunities and those challenges, not really technologically, but really from a business standpoint.
Of
Thank
course.
you. Yeah.
Indeed. We will talk about that later because I think you point out to something that can be very interesting in terms of the coordination between countries. We have seen that the African Union is quite active in that sense, trying to bring countries together to make sure that there is a relatively harmonized legislation so that investments are actually easier from one country to another. But before that, I would like to come back to the European experience and how has it been for Europe to try to jump as well on this digital wave, and how can Europe actually contribute to development in Africa through these digital tools?
And thank you very much for the question. Hearing my former colleagues of the panel, I think that I sometimes propose that Europe needs a data deal, taking inspiration in the Green Deal. You have the Green Deal to integrate a policy to fight climate change. I think you need also in Europe a data deal. What means a data deal? A data citizenship deal. It's to have this kind of agreement between people and institutions. People give his data with capacity to be protected in this data, but sometimes, or in counterpart, they receive good services and services that could improve his quality of life. And I think this kind of data deal, that is different from what is doing in the United States or in China, where the data is completely open to the government and so on, or in India, could make a difference because it's an approach with the values embedded. But to make this data deal, not only in Europe, but in Europe and in Africa, and to use this data deal to improve the partnership between equals that we wish between Europe and Africa, we need to invest, to create conditions where a bigger investment in Africa. So you need to have the infrastructure layer to expand networks and platforms to make sure that they reach underserved communities, and this is really very important. The personal equipment, as co-president of the Joint Parliamentary Assembly, Africa, European Union, before the pandemics, I make a lot of trips through Africa, and I see that every people has a device, but not a device that could be able to receive this kind of good for his life services. Okay, so it's important to enable access to affordable smart devices, 4G, 5G phones, but also tablets, computers, high-speed connectivity in schools, hospitals, and community centers. It's not easy, but it's necessary. No, I know that they need also water, they need also energy, they need also other things, but this is absolutely crucial. And also you need to help the entrepreneurs to develop good services, to develop real applications that improve the life of people. And you can perhaps to begin to make something about the vaccination. I think it's important to have a long-term approach, but even in Europe, we understand that the need to have the certificates of vaccination and also the cybersecurity is another issue. But the question of to give this very important direct answer, put the systems working together. And I remember that because it's during the presidency of the Council of the European Union or Portuguese presidency that you need to try to do that. Perhaps to try to improve the European answer to the needs of vaccination, to produce vaccines, to distribute vaccines, to change perceptions in Africa with digital support could be a very immediate way to open doors.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think it was very interesting what you mentioned about data sharing, because indeed it's something that we even experience in Europe. It's a challenge. So trying to move from that into on a global perspective might be very interesting, but also a challenge as well.
But Europe and Africa, there are multilateral territories. So you need the multilateral approach, because in the world there are other that are not multilateral. I think it's a very strong challenge. Sorry.
We will have a summit next week, so I'm sure that we're going to have that kind of discussion between European and African leaders indeed.
Yeah, no, I know.
I wanted to come back to Dr. Guwa, because one of the challenges that we have been mentioned as well, it's education and how we need to provide the skills so that actually companies can have access to properly skilled workers for those new advances in terms of digitalization. You work a lot in that sense in the African Innovation Hub. How has it been your experience? Do you think that Africa still needs to push for more presence of STEAM in universities? How do you see the evolution of education linked to this digital transformation of the economy?
Thank you very much for that question. I think that digital skills are definitely an issue right now in Africa. There have been lots of programs from Europe, like the Digital for Development, meant to kind of support this. But I think what entrepreneurs and even businesses in Africa would like to see is even more investments in this upskilling. Um, I think it's I, I think it's clear that Africa is one of the fastest, actually the fastest growing region in the world in terms of population. And there's going to be lots of demand on this continent that corresponds to this growth that can only be met by corresponding growth in digital services. And so yes, I do think that education plays an important role. I think lots of universities in the region are putting in more efforts into these digital programs. But I think that continued partnership with Europe, I'm very happy that we have a former minister from Estonia here, because Estonia is kind of a beacon in that regard. I think that there's a lot that can be gained from partnerships with countries like Estonia that have been successful in advancing digitalization, both from a business and government perspective. Um, and so I think that is what African entrepreneurs would like to see more of.
Of course. Now that you mentioned Estonia, indeed, I wanted to turn to Mr. Dames for this. How was that process into boosting education linked to that digital transformation that the country was going through? And what do you think that all the countries might learn from Estonia in that sense?
Mm-hmm. As mentioned, we started actually our digital transformation called Tiger Leap from the educational system. So the focus was particularly on our pupils, our students, and then providing them the access to the basic infrastructure and computers, but also to the digital skills. So since 1990s, we have mandatory curricula that every pupil has to go through in the school. And on top of that, we have also extra curriculum activities so that to provide opportunities for those who are interested in learning more about digital skills. For instance, since kindergarten already, we have basic programming classes, robotics classes. We pay lots of attention on gender equality. We have a program called Unicorn Squad for girls, so that especially for girls, so that girls would feel empowered and feel encouraged to learn these skills and also become employees or founders of new companies in the future after they graduate, or if not, then at least have an opportunity to consider that sometimes in the future. On top of that, we still have basic ICT skills free for everyone, and this is with a special focus nowadays on older generation, so that they wouldn't miss out from the transformation and would be updated with basic ICT skills. And we have seen also that this approach is working. It is providing a pool for the talent, for the companies, for the public sector, and nowadays we are actually working a lot, or the government is working a lot with the private sector by establishing new schools for the programmers with some experimental new approaches, because our companies are still missing thousands, even tens of thousands of people who would have immense opportunities in the new startup and ICT sector.
So still this collaboration, public-private sector,
Exactly.
is actually
this is
absolutely
key.
key. That's definitely one of the things that we are seeing during this debate. Let me get back again to Mr. Wowo, because I was wondering about this gender issue. Normally we should have 2 women represented in this panel, but we've been having issues in terms of connection. And I wanted to talk about that as well, to what extent the Africa Innovation Hub also works to make sure that more women are actually involved in STEM professions, to what extent gender is an issue that you take into consideration when you try to boost this education towards the digital transformation, to try to help companies to rebuild themselves and try to jump into that wave. So is it something that you do? Do you approach women? It's a gender issue part of that work that you're doing?
Thank you very much for this question. So what we find in Africa in general, and this is supported by surveys, is that Africa has some of the highest rates of entrepreneurship in the world, and this is largely driven by women, right? This is largely driven by female entrepreneurship. But when you zoom in on digital entrepreneurship in particular, you start to see a digital divide. So there's a digital divide that occurs regionally, like I mentioned earlier, between urban and rural areas. But there's one that's less talked about, and that's the gender divide, the digital divide based on gender. And so what we see is most of the startups coming out of Africa right now are started and led by men. And we definitely feel like there's a lot more to be done in getting women into more technical or more technological fields, particularly into fields that have to do with digitalization. And it's definitely something that we do prioritize. I think more broadly, and that's kind of what I'm hoping to get out of this meeting, is that I believe that Africa currently has lots of issues when it comes to digitalization. I absolutely believe that we are going to solve these issues eventually, but I think that these issues will be solved faster with a partnership with Europe, especially the countries that have kind of gone through these issues already and solved these issues. And I think this is important because, like I mentioned earlier, Africa is the new frontier. We're the fastest growing region in the world. And I think that whichever partners kind of getting on the ground floor gets to kind of build the competencies and the backbone to continue to support and to continue to benefit from the growth that's coming to Africa. As a quick example, there's a reason why many corporations today still rely on Windows. It's not necessarily because it's the best operating system out there. I'm making no judgment about that, but it's because once you get in on the ground floor, as Microsoft has done, it's often very difficult switch infrastructures. And that is kind of what I'm advocating for. I want Europe to get in the ground floor of Africa, so that we continue to be partnerships, as we continue to be partners as we have always been going forward. Thank you.
Mr. Zorino, in this sense, how do you think that Europe can actually contribute to the economic growth in Africa through the digital transformation? What do you think is missing in the strategy that we have seen so far coming from Europe?
The most important is critical mass. The most important is also financing. But all of we know that the digital solutions can transform health, education, agriculture, and financial inclusion sectors. However, you need to you have strong proposals to do that. And I want to address a more political issue, but I think is very important. All this effort to create more digital infrastructures, to have more devices, more digital services, need to unlock first the digital entrepreneurship, but secondly need to contribute to create jobs. There are billions and billions of young people in Africa without jobs, and this lack of jobs is, in my opinion, one of the most important sources of insurgencies, conflicts in the continent. When recently I led a mission to Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, a joint mission between 6 members of ACP, 6 members of European Union, and when we talk with people, what we see it's a kind of these young people need to have a sense for life and an opportunity to realize your life and to create your purpose of life. So this is very, very important to link all this admirable new world with the concrete life of people, mostly the young people that if is not included in this transformation is very easily contacted by groups to create problems. And in a continent that is a continent of the future and have all the opportunities to develop.
See you nodding very strongly and to the affirmations from Mrs. Zorino. How do you see these? And in particular, we were talking about before this question of the public-private cooperation to make sure that there is sufficient funding, indeed, not only to launch the companies as you do, but also to make sure that they grow over time so that they can actually create those jobs that are missing in the continent.
Yeah, no, for me, I think I like always to compare Europe to Africa or developed countries to developing countries. So when I look at Europe and when I talk about employment in Europe, the most like organizations creating jobs are small and medium enterprises. So if you look at European statistics, you'll find 90% of all the jobs are coming from companies. So then if you go again to our continent, you look at, okay, what is providing jobs at least? So officials, government jobs. So you see, then you see then there is a gap. So NGOs in Africa or government organizations are the one providing jobs. So, but in order to create sustainable jobs, as he was saying, we need to create more jobs. In order to create jobs, we need to create companies. In order to create companies, we need to educate young people to become entrepreneurs. And then it's not only about education, because then you can get an entrepreneurship mindset, but without funding, then there is another problem. So what you see right now on the ground, so that's why we started what we're doing right now. So you have many educational programs, you have many incubators on the continent, teaching soft skills, helping people to become entrepreneurs, but there are no funding. So you can go to an incubator in Africa, you can spend 6 months, you come out with a good pitch deck, a good business plan, and then where do you go? Nowhere, because there is no what we call in the entrepreneurship jargon, let's say seed capital. There are only loans and microfinance. In Europe, we didn't create all these big companies with microfinance. We created all these big companies with venture capital, with seed capital. There is no this space is empty. in Africa. So you don't have the seed capital market. You don't have the private equity. What you have is a young entrepreneur with a bank loan or a microfinance. So without closing this gap, which is estimated, by the way, at 300 billion by the World Bank, everybody knows about it, but nobody's working on it. So that is the problem. You cannot, we need jobs. Not to create jobs, it's just you need to create companies. And then how do you create companies? You need to provide seed capital to young people to pilot things. And then some will fail, some will grow. And then that's how you create jobs.
How do you... Go ahead. Yes.
Yes, maybe just to share some experiences also, again, from my country. Because we had a similar problem 10, 15 years ago. And so how did we address it was that in partnership with European Investment Bank, European Investment Fund, and the government, and the private sector, we launched sort of joint ventures where these institutions and government were the sort of the anchor investors into the new investment funds, and then again these new investment funds that were managed by experienced entrepreneurs themselves. They started providing the seed investment, some bigger rounds of venture capital, and also they were conditioned to participate and personally guide these new companies through the sort of death valley, so that the companies would survive. And this approach has proven immensely successful, and I would really encourage to take up this similar approach with the help of EIB, EBRD, World Bank in Africa, in partnership with local entrepreneurs with successful track records, and then providing the sort of the anchor investment in order to attract investors from Africa, but also outside, from Europe, from US, so that to lay the basis for the investments.
That is a very interesting approach. Do you think that this could actually help to bridge that gap that you were talking about?
Yes, indeed, because I always look at one simple example, which is Nigeria. If you look at the startups, seen in Africa, you look at the most funded startup in Africa are in Nigeria, and then who is investing in those startups? Americans, because Americans, they are doing that approach you were saying. So you are a young African entrepreneur, you have a great idea, apply to Y Combinator. So you go to Y Combinator, it's just an ecosystem with only entrepreneurs, and then before you know, you build a unicorn. So, and then how many African entrepreneurs can go to Y Combinator? But so we need to build that local ecosystem. That's the only way to create jobs.
And how is Wagency contributing to that?
So that's what we do indeed. So we are a startup as well. So how it all started. It started with a trip in Ghana when I was working for an incubator from the Netherlands, going to Ghana, and then I could see some young entrepreneurs with great ideas, and then from me I was teaching them how to pitch, how to write a business plan. But then I knew that when I leave, there is no money. And then I was living in the Netherlands. I was like, okay, maybe if I put 1,000 euros in this startup, and then I go back to Europe, maybe this company would grow. And then I noticed that most people in the diaspora as well, but also Europeans, would like to contribute to those young entrepreneurs. But then there is no such structure. So that's what then we start creating. So creating that structure where we can vet promising startups in Africa, and then create what he was talking about, an angel investor ecosystem in Europe of people who want to invest in those companies. So that's then what we do.
Which goes back to the question as well of trying to take down all the different barriers that you can find when you try to make that investments, but then you find that from one country to another, the legislation is different, the taxes is different, and you need to try to harmonize that to some extent. Mrs. Sorinho, how do you think that Africa can learn from the European Union in that sense? We have a capital market union, still we have to develop quite further, but we have arrived to some extent to harmonize that kind of legislation to make sure that it's easier to invest from one country to another, that there is some certainty both for investors but also for companies in that sense.
It makes all sense. It's absolutely fundamental. But what we need is to try to transform the digital ecosystem. And the digital ecosystem is not today digital ecosystem in Estonia or in Portugal or in Nigeria or in Cameroon. It's a global one. And the global ecosystem is not favorable to Europe. It's not favorable to Africa also. We know that the global ecosystem is now led by mostly by the big United States companies that work worldly in all the world. And in Europe, for instance, we are now approving new legislation about the Digital Market Act, the Digital Service Act. I was rapporteur in the Digital Market Act. We try to have the level playing field. But what could be interesting is also to cooperate Africa and Europe that are multilateral territories and unions to try to have more influence with our embedded values perspective, to more influence in the global ecosystem. That could be very, very important to give us some advantage. And for that, you need to increase the partnerships. You have the same problem, for instance, in Portugal. Is the good enterprises that begin in Portugal, after when they try to be an unicorn, they go to London or they go to the United States. So what you need is really to create a network that could be positive and attractive. I know that now I think in this panel is also my obligation to speak a little more about the political issue. I think that sorry, I will continue.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to take this opportunity to actually bring Anita Anquirote, who is a public consultant, in, because she... Give me just 1 second, Anita, and we'll get back to you. Go ahead, Mrs. Zorino.
To finish my idea. No, go ahead, please.
Sorry, that's okay. So Anita, thank you so much for joining us today, and sorry for the technical issues that we've been experiencing. We are talking right now about governance, about legislation, about what kind of environment we can create so that actually those startup companies can grow. And I was wondering, how do you see that public policy can help to create that environment?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. And for me, I see that public policy, especially the digital market, is a forefront in this matter. But however, for me, the concern would be, and perhaps maybe the former minister for Estonia can give us a way around it and what he thinks about this, about the foreign payment issues that confront Africa. At the end of the day, we currently have a lot of fintechs in Nigeria and East Africa, to a great extent Kenya, where I come from. And they've been very successful in the East African market, but in the Nigerian market, not so much because of the expenses. And another public policy issue I would outline is over-regulation of the sector. In fact, the government has had to protect the fintechs in East Africa to a great extent, especially the mobile banking in that specific regard to digital economies.
Thank you so much. Indeed, what was the experience in Estonia about foreign investment, but also this question of fintech, which actually is one of the key elements to the digital transformation in Africa?
Well, yeah, in regard to fintech, we have struggled as well, to be honest, to have a right angle from the regulation point of view. So to have a right level of transparency with KYCs, but at the same time not to sort of strangle the new startup companies. So it's a delicate sort of balance to be found in order to make sure that the regulation is there to support the companies, but at the same time making sure that there's no fraud or other misuse of through the new startups. And overall, just a word about the startup ecosystem. It's not sort of something that is growing out of the blue. So there's a conscious focus from the private and public sector to invest, to create this ecosystem, also from the regulation point of view. So and this is really important that the regulation empowers the companies, creates the possibilities for test beds, and helps to for instance, with the data to be used at the same time being conscious about data protection regulations and the principles. So it is definitely important to have a right balance between the regulation and how to use the regulation to empower the companies.
Indeed. I wanted to get back to Dr. Nwowo, and I want to ask him about this question. Like, how do you see legislation either being a form of empowerment for those companies or being a burden for them? And how do you think that African countries could shape the legislation to make sure that they create an environment where those startups can actually grow?
Thank you for that question. Legislation is very important for the entrepreneurs that I've spoken with. It's not, of course, it's the backbone of basically any form of business activity, and it's not particularly around the issue of good or bad legislation at this point. I mean, that's very important. I think the critical issue right now is that, unlike in Europe, where the market is much more integrated, the market in Africa is still very fragmented. And so you often have very different legislations as you cross the border. And this is fine for kind of small businesses who can kind of fly under the radar while doing their business activities. But for businesses hoping to scale across the continent, this is a crucial issue because it means that they have to be very aware of the local context that they're entering into, maybe spend a lot of money getting legal advice, and they have to basically alter their business operations to conform to, or alter their data management to conform to all these regulations. And this is a crucial issue. I think I would like to see a situation where the African Union, for example, takes this up more and tries to develop more harmonized rules for digital business on the continent.
This is one of the main goals of the Africa strategy for digitalization that we have seen, but I think this needs to be further developed and be applied all across the continent to make sure that it actually works. I'm happy to say that we have with us again Ms. Koyeko El-Seba, and I wanted to bring her in to talk a little bit about her experience as a CEO of her company, considering that you work quite a lot with companies in trying to shape their brand to make sure that they have a good presence on social media, that digital marketing is actually one of the key elements of your work. How do you see this digital transformation? What kind of needs have you seen those companies bringing to the table when they ask for help from your company? And what do you think are the main opportunities of this digital growth that you see? We just lost Mr. Seba. It's very complicated to do these conferences these days, so our apologies for the technical issues. So I'm going to turn to Mr. Nkurikie for that, because we were talking about before this discussion, we were talking about this need for coordination between countries. How do you think that could actually bring trust for investors to make sure that they don't have any issue wherever they decide to invest in Africa?
I think for me, I will start by, creating some kind of, let's say, place where all the stakeholders should meet and discuss. So something like a sandbox, as we see here in Europe, in most African countries as well. You have some countries where they have also sandbox. Because when you talk about digital, you need to understand there are two kind of understanding. So entrepreneurs understand what is digital most of the time politicians are not really as fast as entrepreneurs in following up on what is happening. And then when it comes to registration, that's why registration is always late, because startups, entrepreneurs are fast. Government, they need to learn what's going on to put together the right policy. So I think for me, what would start first is like a sandbox where entrepreneurs, governments, financial institutions can meet, just to discuss. Okay, like as an entrepreneur, I can give you an example. I'm in the Netherlands. I have a fintech, so I'm having some issue with the regulation. So I am allowed to start my business. I have to just go to the sandbox, tell the government what I'm doing, and then if they can give me like this place where I can start, piloting what I'm doing, and then later on they can grant me a license, or they can tell me what else to do or what to do. So like in Africa, you don't have those spaces, right? Where entrepreneurs, governments, financial institutions, or other partners can sit together, try to see, okay, we have 20 startups in the health sector. They are developing this. So these are the issues that we see. These are the opportunities. So how can we shape the registration around this? So that's what we don't have in most Africa. Some countries, they have sandboxes, but some don't. And then when it comes to Europe and Africa as well, so we need to create that sandbox, so that place where you bring in some, let's say, legislator in Europe, legislator in Africa, some companies in between who are dealing with some specific issues, and then try to find, okay, this is the problem. The KYC is a big problem, right? So, like an investor in Europe need to comply with the European registration, but an African entrepreneur doesn't have to comply with that. So we have issues with GDPR, KYC. So, but we need to find a place where to sit. So these are the requirements from Europe. These are the requirements from Africa. So this is where we create a place where we can all connect. So we don't have those spaces. We only have issues. We talk about the issues, but we don't have really a place. I mean, at least for in my field, where we can really talk about this and then try to find those solutions. So what we know is just what is forbidden.
We have these kind of conferences. We discuss about the issues, but we don't actually put together politicians and representatives of the business community, and we make sure that they actually solve whatever is on the table, which is a very good thing to know now, because we have here a policymaker. So that's actually very important. So because it's something that we can indeed address. I wanted to bring back Ms. Enkirote again about this issue, and how does she think, whether you actually think that this is indeed something that could help companies to grow in Africa, whether this platform where you have exchange between policymakers and business owners, whether it's members of startups or bigger companies in Africa, can actually meet, see what the needs are, what they are doing, how can help each other, how can make sure that the public environment, the legislation, the governance actually fits the activities that we are seeing growing.
Thank you so much. I actually agree with that the business leaders and the policymakers must come together. In fact, this is what gave birth to the EU Digital Economic Task Force, that is actually talks about creating affordable broadband for Africa, improving skills for the digital age, talks about digital entrepreneurships, talks about e-services, and talks about data economy. It is the business people that are in business, and we leave it to the business people to do business. When they sit down with government that has established these policies, then they can actually tell government that A works, B doesn't work. Let's even take the case of double taxation. Double taxation will require that the entrepreneurs come together, have some form of memorandum, and actually talk to government. Then government can talk and decide that, hey, how are we going to deal with double taxation? So when we look at these specific issues, I believe that people must sit down and talk and have a way forward, because it is the business people that know what the business community want, and the policy makers know how to regulate and what works, because at the end of the day, government must tax, but to what percentage? To what percentage are you taxing the business people to an extent that they don't hurt, and where you do not deregulate a business completely?
Indeed. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Zames, about this question as well. How was your experience in Estonia in this sense? Did you indeed create the kind of platform where policymakers and business owners could meet, but also to some extent was Estonia struggling with the fact that you were evolving much faster in terms of the digital transformation than the rest of Europe, and would that created some form of trouble when it came to actual lack of legislation at European level?
Yes, indeed. So we have several formats where our business people and and regulators, government, politicians meet. So we have 4 times in a year sort of set up a meeting between the government ministers, including prime minister, and the startup community. So democratically elected startup representatives who are bringing on board their issues that they want to be addressed, and then every 3 months, then the ministers have to report back what they have done, and there are on various ministerial competencies also similar sort of platforms where specific issues are addressed. For instance, in edtech sector, there's a setup of platform where the Ministry of Education discusses the issues with the startup community and tries to also take their ideas and new approaches on board to introduce them in the educational system. We have similar platforms in Ministry of Health, so that new startups could use patient data or experience with their new business models and so on. So indeed, these platforms are immensely important to address the gaps in regulation, in government, whatever approach, be it tenders or where there's a lack of good approach. In terms of European Union, indeed, Estonia has been pushing for many years for digital single market. We have been in the forefront of these requests, and this is exactly for the reason that you mentioned, that we saw the pains and of our companies of trying to do business across Europe, and then it wasn't possible. Things have improved thanks also to one of the commissioners from Estonia, Andrus Ansip, formerly the Prime Minister of Estonia. But still, there's room for improvement, and definitely I feel very warmly about the similar struggles in Africa, trying to create a digital single market in Africa. But definitely there's room for improvement in both, and there's room for cooperation in trying to establish these digital single markets.
And in a way, I think that what we have seen is that the EU is a strong force in terms of setting the agenda, but also creating the legislation that then is replicated in other countries. We have seen it with the GDPR. We're seeing it right now with the Digital Single Market legislation. We will see it with the Digital Service Act as well, because we have this approach towards digitalization and businesses that comes with the values attached. We talked about that before as well, the fact that as it happens in Europe, it's happening in Africa, that you see a digital revolution, but the legislation doesn't accompany. So you have a lot of companies that are trying to do business, but there is a lot of legal uncertainty around questions of data sharing, cybersecurity, even consumers' rights, because the environment was just created. So do you think this is also a struggle that can also create mistrust with investors that are trying to bring their money to Africa, but they don't really know how the companies work there, what the legislation is, because it's not there, and making sure that we have the legislation can actually bring the money as well?
Yeah, I see it as a challenge, but in a different way. So from an African perspective, if I am setting up a company, I'm from Burundi, which is a small country in East Africa. So if I will set up a company in Burundi, we don't have anything related to data protection. So it doesn't exist. So if I set up a company, so it's really up to me, how I use the data, how I do my business. Because, like as I was saying, if I would set up a digital business in my country, there is no startup registration, there is nothing around it. So I will just do my business, right? So then how I use the data, it's up to me. So even if I will go to the government, they won't understand what I will be doing, because it's a new field. Maybe they don't know what I'm talking about. So it's just up to me how I share that information, or how I involve the government in what I do. So, but then as a social entrepreneur, I have also social investors in Europe. So then for them, it matters. So what I do with my business, also it matters to me as a social entrepreneur, because for me, it's not to harm the society, it's to bring solutions to the ground. So it's really up to me to make sure that, I correct the right data, I use it the right way. And then just also, we are in Europe, we are then focusing on GDPR. I'm going to give you a concrete example when it comes to KYC. So when it comes to KYC, for me, if I invest in Ghana, in Nigeria through my platform, KYC is not needed on the ground in those countries. But for me, I need KYC from my financial institutions here. So I tend then to really make sure that the rules that I use in Europe are the rules that I use in Africa. So that's then I have this transparent and trustworthy investment platform. But from a business perspective, I can do a lot of things in Africa without being worried by the regulation, because just it doesn't exist. Yeah.
It isn't there. But it's an interesting point as well, right? Because in a way, maybe those companies in Africa that are getting funding from foreign companies, or from, in this case, through agency, they are getting money. They might have higher standards than what you would see in other companies, but that can actually foster that movement into a more legislative environment where, you can have similar standards from one country to another, and that can be also creating a space where investment is
Yes,
more...
indeed. If I can just add on that, so to tell you, our mission is to really build African companies. To build African companies is to make them visible to the investors. So if you want to make them visible to the investors, you need to talk the language of the investor. So the investor wants, like a social business, good KYC, knowing what we're doing with the GDPR. So that's what the investor wants in his portfolio. So for us, then when we go on the ground, so that's the same, let's say, spirit we use. So we want to make everything right, because before they would say, if you invest in a company in Burundi, you don't know that guy, right? So he might disappear with the money. So that's from our perspective. So from the first we onboard an entrepreneur, we want to know that guy. We do the KYC, so now you know the guy. So then when we do the business, and we make sure that we have all the data, so we know that the company is well structured. So from that perspective, for us, our philosophy, it's not, the data is no longer a problem, right? So now, can you then invest in that business opportunity? So that's what we are trying to build. And then it requires a lot of public-private partnerships, because, collecting those data is not part of our business, right? So for us, it's just to link investors to entrepreneurs. But then in the middle, we need to create that environment.
And those with the public authorities are absolutely key. I want to try again to bring into the conversation Kokeyo El Seba, who is joining us from Kenya, and ask her again about her experience working for a company that tried to build the brand of those digital startups that are joining the digital economy in Africa. And what has been your experience? How do you see those companies evolving? What do you think are their main challenges? And following the conversation that we're having, how do you see the transformation of the digital economy in Africa? And what do you think is missing? How can Europe contribute? I want to hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I think we had a problem of connection, but now it's okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
All right. I come from Kenya, and I run a company called Virtual 21 that is digital marketing and a PR firm. And I would say that most of the challenge is the slow to change. Yeah, slow to change. Not everybody. I realize that technology or the digitalization is so fast that we become very defiant and we reject it without knowing. So people do not want to learn much about the tech. They want us to ignore it, or probably some of the companies that when you look at them, they are more inclined to the traditional way and would not want to embrace the digitalization of their businesses. So one of the things is slow to change, and secondly, probably the insufficient skills or the skills needed for one to be on that space. Previously, you guys have mentioned the data protection. I would say that as much as data protection is still key, but we don't have much problems when it comes to that because we have other regulatory authorities that actually deal with that. And I think once you have your business registered or once your business is digitalized, then you are protected. Another problem that we face is the inadequate service, many challenges in regards to that, and also the illiteracy in terms of skills, in terms of education. When you look at the Bureau standards, the Statistics Bureau standards, you'll realize that the illiteracy level is still low, considering we are the peripheral countries, the developing countries, you can't compare. So when you look at the comparative analysis of the Europe and Africa, you'll realize that they're so much ahead. We aspire to be there someday. So I think for the mitigation measures that we can help curb these problems, one is funding. You guys had mentioned funding before. I was following. Then if another area where we need to improve oil is skills.
I think we lost connection again. Very sorry about that. Indeed, the contribution was being very interesting. It was very much in line with what we have been discussing today. I wanted to build a little bit on what Ms. Elseba said about trust, because one of the issues that we saw in Africa as well is that with the development of the digital economy also comes challenges in terms of cybersecurity issues. And this is something we haven't discussed. I was wondering what was the experience in Estonia, a country that also has a very concrete geopolitical context. You have many challenges. So to what extent one had to go in line with the other, make sure that you were protected when you developed your business digitally?
Mm-hmm. Yes, as also mentioned in my intervention, we focus a lot on cyber defenses and personal data protection. So on cyber defenses, the way we have built up our system is by using a decentralized approach. So we don't have any central master databases or central service providers, but all the services are owned by institutions themselves, ministries, agencies, private sector players, and they are connected via the open data shared platform called X-Road, which is overseen again by state institution that is sort of also handling the cybersecurity of this system. So this decentralized approach is, I think, key in beefing up the defenses, and there's also a strong element of cooperation between the public and private sector in order to share the information, in order to make sure that the defenses are strong both in public and also private sector. I think another important element is basic cyber hygiene of the people, because many of the attacks happen through just phishing emails or just from the personal level. So it is important that there's a strong cyber hygiene in both public and private sector, and we pay lots of attention to this. In terms of personal data protection, as mentioned, our citizens own their data. I have a right to log into the my e-citizen account and see who has watched my data, and have a right to inquire why my data has been watched by certain officials. And if they can't justify that, I have a right to sue them. And there are many cases where actually people have gone into prison for that, for looking or unauthorized access to the personal data. And we also are very conscious about who has a right to watch the data or to access the personal data. So we are not sharing the data hastily.
I was wondering, how do you see, Mr. Zorino, in terms of the cybersecurity, what can be the role of the EU? What we are seeing is a lot of collaboration between different member states. How can that feed into the discussion with Africa as well to make sure that investors are sure of the protection of their money, of their data, of their businesses, if they decided to go into business in general?
When we speak about cybersecurity, the cooperation is absolutely fundamental, and it's important also to have a secure exchange of data between the different states, different policies, and different bodies that try to do that. And the cooperation about security and governance with Africa is also very important. But let me tell that you that I fully agree with the idea that the critical mass, it's absolutely fundamental for all, to develop infrastructures, develop enterprises, develop the cybersecurity, and for that the idea to develop informal or formal networks is absolutely critical. To have a ground to harmonize legislation, to have a ground to have bigger markets, bigger financing, it's absolutely critical to have this kind of networks. And in next week we have the European Union, African Union summit. It's a very good opportunity to launch informal and formal network of stakeholders. During the Portuguese presidency, in the beginning of last year, we launched in Lisbon the Entrepreneurship European Network. We have also the Web Summit, but Web Summit is another thing in Lisbon. But we launched that. I think it's important to launch this kind of networks, putting people talking, learning, and working together. And in a more political perspective is what I want to say when in my last speech. You have in Europe a very strong instrument to finance and to help the cooperation with Africa. This is the Global Europe Instrument. But the Global Europe Instrument has a condition. We need, and it's very good, it's not bad, we need to respect the sovereignty of different countries. So this kind of funds need to be applied in dialogue with the governments. And what we feel sometimes that in most of the countries in Africa, there are yet poor governance in this perspective. And so we need to complement these funds like the Global Europe Instrument with more direct public-private partnerships. And I think it's the critical issue to have a partnership between equals and not a donor-beneficiary perspective in the relationship between Europe and Africa, is to develop the civil society in Africa, to develop the civil society, to have more projects that come from the basis to the top and not only hold by the top to the base. I have not against, I don't want to interfere in countries that are sovereign, but usually the top-down approach works worse than the bottom-up in these fields.
Do you share this view of that bad governance, or the perception of bad governance sometimes also push away investors that might otherwise would like to invest in those brilliant ideas and startups that they see growing in Africa?
Yeah, I fully agree on the issue of bad governance, and you cannot grow, like entrepreneurship or businesses or create jobs in a government that is full of corruption, when there is no regulation, when a business is set up by acquaintances, when there is no straightforward way to go. So I think the issue of bad governance is a strong one. So for me, I always think about how do you inspire leaders to work for the people. So this is, for me, I used to think it was through education, and but I don't think it's. I think it's not education, because most leaders in the world are well educated. So it's
some of them are educated in all the world, and they return.
Yeah. So it's not about education. So then what it is? So for me, that's one of the questions when it comes to civil society. Sometimes I say yes, sometimes I say no. Because why I say yes is because we need some institutions that can talk for the poor, or for those who cannot talk. But civil society they are not sustainable. They're not sustainable in the long run because they are just driven by a project. Let's say EU would come to my country in Burundi. They say now we're going to advocate on digital. So they will have a mandate for 1 year to advocate on digital. After that mandate, they will do something different. Yes. So there is no continuity when it comes to civil society. So they will always follow, for me, what I call the grant or the money. So there is no really long-term vision when it comes to civil society. But then I know it's always complicated to work directly with entrepreneurs. Because for me, I would say, how do you work with the private sector directly with entrepreneurs? So I know it's always a big question, but because for me, I know that entrepreneurs are in there for the long run. So they are not there for only 1 year. So they are building a company that will last so the vision is to last for at least forever. So that's the ambition. So if you start working with the private sector, you are from the beginning, you are working hand in hand. At least this is not going to, let's say, to die after the grant money. So the company will keep going. So that's really that conversation. Okay, having the civil society, but also look at the private sector from more the long term. Because why I'm talking about that? If you look at all the money that has been spent in Africa, it goes through civil society most of the time, let's say. And then when it comes to digital and entrepreneurship, you give money to civil society organizations to create incubators. So as an example, so they're not entrepreneurs. So how can someone who is not an entrepreneur create an incubator? How can someone who didn't learn about entrepreneurship now start teaching entrepreneurship? So it cannot be like that. So even if you look at in Europe, incubators or anything that is created is by people who know the topic. So when you go to Africa, all incubators, 80% of them are created by people working for the civil society organization. So that's why I say, we need to look at it differently. Yes, let's work with the civil society, but at least let's work with people who knows the topic and then who are in there for the long run, not just for the grant. So
let me bring this into this conversation, Dr. Wogo, because you actually you're the director of and the co-founder of the African Innovation Hub. How has been your experience in this work, and to what extent you agree with this approach that indeed it's not only about civil society, but it's especially about working with the private sector, and that here both having a harmonized legislation, a legal certainty for companies, but also good governance is absolutely key to see those companies grow?
Thank you. I definitely agree with my colleagues that that bad governance is an issue. I just wanted to put that out there. I also agree that civil society does have a very crucial role to play, but may not necessarily be the solution. I think instead, when we talk about these issues of kind of supporting entrepreneurship and digital innovation, I think instead of universities and other educational institutions, I think these institutions solve these problems of kind of understanding the local context and being there for the long term. But I think that in today's climate, they are often overlooked both by the governments themselves as well as even the entrepreneurs. I think that, when you think of innovation, economists often talk about a triple helix of innovation. That's usually the government, the business or the entrepreneur, and then the third leg of that is usually the universities. And so I think it's important that we bring universities more into these conversations in terms of both providing the education. Um, so when I say universities, I mean all kinds of higher learning institutions. So in terms of both providing the education that the digital economy needs, but also in terms of providing supporting services like incubators, um, and like social education projects to kind of get more women or marginalized communities into entrepreneurship in the digital economy. I think that they are there for the long term. Universities are not going anywhere, um, and they also understand the local context enough to make a difference.
Indeed. I always like to end conferences with wishes because I think it's a good way after having an exchange, after talking about the many challenges that we face, but we can also talk about how we can address them. So today we have President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen in Senegal. We have Commissioner Thierry Breton, Executive Vice President Vestager as well. We have an EU-Africa Summit next week where we are going to see European and African leaders coming together to try to strengthen this partnership that we have been seeing built over the past few years. So I wanted to ask my speakers, what is their wish? What would they tell that room with European and African leaders if they could? What is that they would tell them, like, this is what I need to make my business work, or this is what I need to reinforce the partnership so that we can actually make business together? What is it that we can do together to contribute to the digital transformation, both in Europe and in Africa? Because what I can see from this discussion is that the challenges are actually very similar. We might be at different stages in the process, but when it comes to disconnection of rural areas, or when it comes to education, or when it comes to skill shortages, or when it comes to lack of funding, the issues are the same. The solutions might be a little bit different, but in the end, we all have a very similar vision of what the world should look like. So let me start with Mr. Sorino. What would you tell the European leaders, if you could, that we need to do to reinforce that partnership?
What is really important is to look to the world how it's now, and to understand that Africa and Europe has a long tradition of diversity and cooperation, and we need to improve a multilateral partnership that is a multilateral partnership in the base of values and not in the base of financial dependency or arms dependencies or other kind of dependencies. And we learn with this debate that we need to create conditions to have an entrepreneurship society able to take risks in the long run perspective. And this is absolutely crucial to develop this partnership, to have this long run perspective, to apply to develop education, health, to face nutrition problems, to face other kinds of poverty. But we need to trust on people.
Indeed, we need trust. Ms. Ngirete, I want to get back to you. What is it that you think should be the core of the action between the EU and Africa to make sure that we make the best out of the digital transformation?
Yeah, for me, I think...
She's not there. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah,
no,
sorry.
For me, I think, I would like to see really a good partnership between Europe and Africa when it comes to policy and vision, right? So when we talk about entrepreneurship and job creation, we should understand it the same way. When we talk about job creation and entrepreneurship, is that creating companies? That's it. When it's about creating companies, we know what works in Europe. We should try to help Africa to reach that level. Is helping young entrepreneurs, you know, what he said, to realize their dreams, is to also provide them financial means to create those businesses. For me, it's really those two things. So we know how to create businesses. How can we create an environment that can help, you know, businesses to flourish? And then I agree with him, it's through the multilateral talks, creating that environment where we can look at, okay, these are the problems, how can we create the solutions? So for me, that's I think what might work if we want to work together. Yeah.
And that's already a lot. I'm going to go back to Dr. Owowo for this one. What do you think could Europe, because you were talking a lot about the need to strengthen that cooperation, what do you think Europe could do together with Africa to make sure that we make the best out of the digital transformation and that companies can grow as much as possible to make sure that we create those jobs that are very much needed?
Thank you for that question. I think I think I would like to see more partnership on 3 levels. So I would like to see the European Union and the African Union kind of work together. I think there's a lot that the African Union can learn from the European Union in terms of creating a single digital market. I think that's crucial, especially when we talk of the scalability of digital enterprises. So I would like to see more cooperation so that lessons learned can be shared. and possibly even going forward, making it easier to trade digital services across both continents. Um, I would also like to see more partnerships at the university level or at the higher learning level. There's lots of digital skills that entrepreneurs and would-be entrepreneurs would like to learn that they don't necessarily have access to. And I think that partnerships between universities across both continents could help. And finally, I would like to see a world where European entrepreneurs find it very easy to go to Africa and set up businesses, and vice versa. I would also like to see a world where African entrepreneurs find it very easy to scale their enterprises into the European single markets as well. So I think this is kind of my grand vision for the Africa-European partnership. I know it will take some time, but I'm kind of optimistic that we'll get to something looking like this in the future.
Indeed, and this conversation is trying to fit that action as well. Just to finish, you as coming from one of the leading countries in terms of the digitalization in Europe, what is your wish for the future of Europe as a digital leader, but also how we can contribute to shape the revolution in other countries?
Indeed, in terms of Europe, I would very much hope that the digital single market reforms go further, and the entrepreneurs in Europe have a more easier job to do. But in terms of Africa, I would hope to see more practical application of cooperation, so that to address concrete issues today. As I'm an entrepreneur also myself, from the practical side, I would hope that the approaches that have worked and could have a beneficial outcome would be applied. For instance, the case of financing to help to mitigate the risk with the help of international financial institutions, and attract more investment into Africa in partnership with local entrepreneurs. Let's use the potential that we have and make it happen.
Let's make it happen indeed. As you have heard, some of the key elements are making sure that funding is available and that it actually works, making sure that we promote partnerships between African and European countries, but also companies across the borders to make sure that they can develop their business, and partnerships in terms of education as well, because those are keys to make sure that we confront the skill shortages, but especially because nothing of that nothing of this could ever happen without trust. Building trust is absolutely key. I'd like to thank all of my speakers for their contributions today, for those who were joining us online, and very sorry for the technical issues that didn't allow us to enjoy a little bit more the knowledge of those two speakers that couldn't join us today. But thank you so much for following us. You can continue watching today at 12:30. We have another conference on the infrastructural deficit in Africa that is very much linked to what we were talking about today, and how we can transform urban landscape into a more sustainable cities for everyone to be part of them and to be happy and fair and healthy. Thank you so much again for being part of this conversation. Let the conversation keep on going, keep on building trust, and making sure that we make those business works both in Africa and Europe. Thank you so much.
Bonjour, bienvenue à cette deuxième session.
Good afternoon and welcome to this second session of our second day of Africa Week, organised by the Social Democrat group in the European Parliament, a group that has honoured me by asking me to chair this panel. My name is Siname Kofi. We will be talking for the next hour about infrastructure and above all about the deficit of infrastructure in Africa and how we can transform the urban landscape into sustainable cities for the continent of the future. So in this session, we will be looking at a situation where there are shortcomings, there are deficits, but there are useful new tools that we could mobilize to take stock of the situation. But we are going to approach things today from a development paradigm, and looked at in terms of that paradigm, there are major disparities in terms of infrastructure on the African continent. And between Africa and the world as a whole today, just to give you a few indications, the vast majority of Africans still live more than 2 kilometers away from the nearest road. Infrastructure, about half only of Africans have access to electricity. Basic water treatment facilities are available to less than 1/3 of the population, and the same applies to sources of drinking water. The difficulties of accessing a clean drinking water supply are responsible for 80% of illnesses in our continent. So this is a major structural deficit, and there are also economic problems and factors which mean that our continent is not competitive internationally because of these shortcomings. So all of these facts, which might seem alarming, are of course a transitional situation because our country is undergoing exceptional growth. The population is growing so fast that soon, 1 in 3 inhabitants of this planet will be African, and we represent about 1/6. Soon about 1/6 of the urban population of the world will be in Africa. So this is why the infrastructure issues that we will be discussing today are so crucial for Africa. Around 2/3 of the infrastructure that we need aren't even in the planning stage at the moment, and the World Bank considers that constant investment of 12 billion euros a year will be necessary in order to fill this gap. It is a great honor for me to discuss these subjects today with some excellent quality guests present here. So with me I have Ms. Alice Usanas, who is Vice President and Acting Head of Country Relations of Africa Finance Corporation. We also have Naomi Mwara, who is the Executive Director of Flown Initiative in Kenya, with me here in the studio, because the two ladies I've just announced are joining us remotely. But here in the studio we have Mr. Eric Andrieux, who's a member of the European Parliament and a member of the Socialists and Democrats group and a member of the Parliament's Development Committee. And on my right I have Mr. Conny Reuter, who is the Global Coordinator of Progressive Alliance. So before we begin our debate, we would like to show a little video message from Mr. Francisco André, who is the Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation from Portugal.
I'm very happy to join you for the Africa Week, such an important initiative ahead of the EU-AU summit and very much revealing of the S&D Group's commitment towards supporting the reinforcement of the European Union-Africa partnership. I'd like to thank you for inviting me, especially to Irache Garcia, our dear group leader and friend, and also to Udo, who is also so committed in this field of cooperation and development. Fellow colleagues in this panel, and ladies and gentlemen, we all know the figures, and we all know how critical it is to overcome the infrastructural deficit in Africa in order to achieve sustainable and inclusive development for the continent. African countries have demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of global economic adversity, health, and social consequences of the pandemic. Much needs to be done, particularly regarding the increase of vaccination rates. Transforming this resilience into better living conditions for the African populations will require strong policy action, effective planning, and investment to promote faster and more inclusive growth. The continent is being urbanized at an historic pace, with an unprecedented demographic expansion. It finds no parallel in what has happened in other regions, but it has yet to be supported by significant and adequate structural transformation. Urbanization will, already is, profoundly transform African societies. Despite this, 2/3 of the planned investments in urban infrastructures are expected to remain unfulfilled by 2050. It is therefore imperative that we rise up to the challenge. New and comprehensive urban policies are needed to transform African cities into driving forces of sustainable and inclusive development, helping to meet the challenges of sustainability, climate emergency, energy transition, digital transformation, and sustainable mobility. Urbanization can contribute to promote economic growth and have potential positive impact on human development, on more secure and inclusive housing systems and strong social safety nets, but also when it comes to the promotion of sustainable environmental management. I thus believe we have a major opportunity ahead of us to match the urban transition, which offers these new ways to enhance economic and social development with the digital and green transitions in view of achieving the SDGs, as well as the goals of the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. Supporting the development of smart and green cities will be crucial to enable delivering these goals, using technology to create better public services and to reduce environment impact. Good practices in each of these areas obviously will contribute significantly to have new attractive cities and to improve people's lives. We strongly believe that the key is cooperation between countries, including at mayors level through the so-called city diplomacy, but also inside each country taking profit of the potential for cross-sectorial strategic cooperation between public administration, universities, and companies. We need to find common solutions to address global challenges, and that means we need to look at what is being done, not only in Europe, but as well as in Africa and other parts of the world. This approach includes stepping up investment in urban infrastructure, improving the connection between cities and rural areas, as well as improving the provision of infrastructure and services within and between cities. Such investments should be underpinned by productive formal employment, particularly for young people. Efforts must also be mobilized to meet the continent's needs of increased investment. It will require more funding, innovative finance, and the presence of the private sector. The European Union has set up an innovative financing instrument to support its cooperation from 2021 to 2027, the NDC Global Europe. It has an overall amount of almost 80 billion euros, of which 30 billion are allocated to sub-Saharan Africa and more to the southern neighborhood. The NDC Global Europe programming process has now been concluded, and several Team Europe initiatives at country, regional, and continental levels are being designed to further maximize development impact through the mobilization of additional resources from member states, the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the European Development Financial Institutions. At the same time, the European Commission and our friend Commissioner Jutta Urpilainen launched the Global Gateway, aiming at mobilizing up to 300 billion euros in investments to support a sustainable global recovery in line with our partners' needs. This new European strategy is all about investing in both hard and soft infrastructure to boost smart, clean, and secure links in digital, energy, and transport, but also to strengthen health, education, and research systems across the world while promoting competitiveness and global supply chains. It stands for sustainable and trusted connections that work for people and the planet to tackle the most pressing global challenges. The next European Union-African Union Summit presents, therefore, a unique opportunity to make effective European Union's commitment towards Africa, as well as the consolidation of a partnership that is both fruitful and mutual benefiting. Thank you very much and have a fruitful session.
Merci au secrétaire d'État.
Thank you to the Secretary of State for his message. So let's get down to the debate. I would like to remind you that I am going to be moderating the discussion today for those of you here in the discussion and those of you following on the internet. So you can comment on Twitter, Facebook and YouTube, so don't hesitate to ask questions as well if you're following this. I'd like to begin by turning to Naomi Mora. As I said, you are Executive Director of Flown Initiative, which is trying to achieve more professional and safer public transport in Kenya. As perhaps not everybody following the debate is very familiar with Africa, perhaps you can explain a little bit more about what is meant by the infrastructure deficit on the continent.
Thank you, Mr. Kofi. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for taking time to join us today. And a follow-up to the moderator's question, maybe we could have a conversation. So I invite you to type in the chat or comment box how many of you have been on the African continent, which country did you visit or live in, and based on your experience, what were or are the infrastructure deficit that you experienced? And this is $1 million question. I will try to comprehensively answer the question, but let me start with the obvious. Infrastructure policies and investment influence the daily lives of Africans in various facets of their lives, both socially, health-wise, and financially. And this influence varies based on an individual's socioeconomic status, gender, and sometimes even culture. And so, for example, in my home country, Kenya, a report by Deloitte mentions that 70% of commuters in Kenya use small-size buses or public transport vehicles, as we normally call them, matatus, as part of their daily commute. 25% use buses and 39% use motorcycle or a two-wheeler taxi. And in addition, 45% of residents in the capital city walk as part of their daily commute and also part of their last mile connectivity. But then despite walking and public transport being the dominant mode of transport, it is generally the least considered when we come to urban planning and investment. And so you find that the current infrastructure prioritizes the personal car, whose research has shown that occupancy rate is usually on average 2 passengers. And what do I mean by infrastructure parity? It's the way that cities and urban areas and upcoming urban areas prioritize the allocation of parking, which will only serve, as I mentioned, only 30% of the population. Cutting trees as a way to make way for road expansion, as opposed to building safe walking and connected walking lanes, providing tree shades, safe crossings. And in addition to that, providing social public transport amenities such as bus terminus and mass transit system. And so I think going back to the question of what happens when there is a disconnect between transport infrastructure and investment, and especially when this investment do not align with people's day-to-day realities, we find that this further amplifies the inequalities in our societies and sometimes can be a matter of life and death, and in a most cruel way. So, for example, you find that the Kenya National Transport and Safety Authority in 2020 warned that pedestrian fatalities were on the rise. in a country that already has one of the highest pedestrian fatality rates in the world. And in addition, still trying to be as comprehensive as possible, Frederick Elbert Foundation in Kenya and Flown Initiative conducted a research study aimed at enhancing research to improve public transport accessibility for people with disability. And the research showed that accessibility of public transport still remains a mirage to users with disabilities due to the policy, technical, and social challenges that are intertwined. But then despite the high societal costs that I've already mentioned, they still continued increased investment in road space for cars, and this has continued to be a priority for both investors and governments. However, I would like to point out that it's not all gloom. There are commendable efforts being made by African governments. And let me give an example. So I was hosting a friend in Kenya, my dear friend Elsa from Guinea-Bissau. And she told me, Naomi, I don't want to hear you complaining about your country. Your roads are as good as Portugal. And Elsa wasn't wrong in her observation. The Kenyan government has continuously continued to invest in heavy infrastructure development with funding both from local and international entities. So presently, the public transport sector and as a whole, the infrastructure development contributes to about 8% of the GDP of our country, making it the second highest contributor after agriculture, forestry, and fishing. And currently, there's an ever expanding infrastructure, and this has included, and this list is not comprehensive, the revival of the rail network, the construction of new commuter rails, the expansion of aviation facilities, increased container handling capacity at the ports, construction and rehabilitation of roads all around the country. And so, in conclusion, I'd like to say I acknowledge all these developments, but in the same breath, I would like to finish up by saying that I think there's still room for improvement.
Je reste un peu avec vous, Naomi, juste...
Very much, Naomi. What I would say is that you talk about disparities, you talk about shortcomings, but often this is something that accentuates other inequalities, things like gender inequality, for example. You've been involved in the My Dress, My Choice initiative. I wonder if you would be so kind as to talk to us about the relationship between infrastructure and gender in Africa. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think data, looking at gender disaggregated data has started coming up, where we are seeing more research companies disaggregate data based on gender. And as we know that already women and men experience the world differently, and it's not any different when we look at infrastructure experience. And when we look at infrastructure, it's not just the movement of people from point A to B, either to access jobs, social amenities, and education. But as Flown, we normally say it's a stage where human interactions occur. And for women, most of these interactions are negative. Let me pick one commuter challenge that our research has shown, and this is the issue of sexual harassment. And and link this also to the My Dress, My Choice protest, which was protesting the negative experiences Kenyan women experienced using public transport. And specifically the issue of sexual harassment. In a study conducted by Flown, we found out that 88% of women that we reached out to had either experienced or witnessed sexual harassment. But I would like to point out that this is not unique to Kenya. In a study conducted in the US back in 2014, they also found that sexual harassment was the second most common place for street harassment. That figure, as compared to Kenya, that figure in Cairo is even higher, where about 95% of women have been harassed. And so I would like to broadly say that there's not a single transportation where women don't experience this type of harassment. And bringing it back home, Flown Initiative research shows that the commuting challenges have led to a couple of negative ripple effects. One of them being massive financial loss for women, more commute time as they try to avoid dangerous routes, and eventually women drop out of a system that isn't built for them, isn't designed to support their travel needs, and puts them in danger. And that means that instead of women taking easy, environmentally sustainable, and affordable transportation to work and other places, they either decline or leave jobs that require a commute, and in addition, spend their hard-earned money and monies to invest or acquire more expensive modes of transport, which are not, again, sustainable. And so we are optimists. We don't think public transport is a lost cause, but believe that ultimately we can make public transport the preferred mode of transport and workplace for women and their families.
Merci Naomi, nous vous retrouverons.
Thank you very much indeed. Naomi will come back to you later when we have a discussion. You're quite right. These are issues that everybody is concerned by around the world. We need to think about mobility as a form of emancipation. And we don't want the sector to set these kind of inequalities in stone still further. We want to ensure that creators and inventors are able to try to alleviate and mitigate these kind of biases that we see, particularly in sectors like mobility and transport. I'd now like to hear from Alice Usanasi, who I'm sure will be very well acquainted with these issues of gender, but also finance and investment. I have the impression that there is something of a paradox. Around the world, people talk about Africa as being somewhere that is particularly high risk when it comes to a return on investment, but equally, I think that the sector, thanks to the demographic boom that we have seen, and indeed the huge infrastructure market that the continent will present in future, I wonder if you could perhaps demystify this. I know that you have come out with a report on transport and infrastructure investment in Africa. What do we need to do to green transport? Who are the best people to get involved? You have the floor.
And good afternoon, everyone.
On a une très mauvaise connectivité.
Unfortunately, the connection that we've established with Alice Usanasi is extremely poor. I don't know whether we can try to re-establish that connection. Otherwise, we'll come back and hear from her later on. So without further ado, let's move on to sustainability issues, and we'll hear from you, Eric Andrieux. It's not exactly entirely disconnected from this issue of gender. Maybe we'll get into that subtlety a bit later, but I know that we have this report on sustainability, and it would appear that Africa and infrastructure feels that sustainability is key. Do you think that's something we have to take into account? Do we really have to be concerned about sustainability, or is providing transport the overriding concern? Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for your question. Thank you for the invitation to this discussion in an effort to try to get a grip on this issue. I think certainly it's a partnership, but to answer your question, I'm in the camp where I would say that today we can't purely consider this as a long term. We can't simply say that we fall victim to short-termism either, because I think experience goes to show that that does not get results. We don't develop and progress. So there is something that is important today. This isn't a recent development either, and you talk about this in your introduction. There's a lot of sensitivity around climate change. Now, during the pandemic, we've seen that we are all wrestling with all kind of issues that are not local, they're not regional, they're not national. These are global issues. Now, obviously, there's no question that Africa has to be involved in those discussions, has to be a stakeholder, will provide significant answers to that difficulty. So we have to respond to a warming climate. We all need to participate. We all need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions. First of all, we have to protect biodiversity. There are lots of imbalances that we have given rise to over the last 40, 50 years. And Africa, certainly in terms of its history, is facing demographic changes, crises, and it will surely have to be taken into account when we try to tackle this issue at a global level. But what have we done in the past? We've tried to solve the issue in Europe, or certain member states have tried to impose a post-colonial approach, if I can put it like that, trying to impose themselves to dominate, and that hasn't entirely fallen by the wayside. That was part of the report, but this is a shared endeavor. This isn't only African, it's equally African as much as it is Indian, Chinese, Russian, or for the US to solve. So we have to reconsider the way we do things. We have to come up with a new form of partnership. So truly, if we don't want to rehash the mistakes of the past, and this is really what I want to get across today, we have to be prepared to approach this with a degree of humility. It's not good enough simply to invest. You need to ensure that the investment hits its target. So we have to start with some kind of assessment. We have to look back and see what we have achieved on the continent of Africa. That's the first thing we have to do today. But for years, the African continent has attempted to roll out infrastructure. It's been trying to acquire investment for more than 20 years now. We've had China coming into the continent. They have a big financial stake. You have to consider whether this investment that is coming in really is meeting the needs. Is it reducing poverty and inequality? Are we ensuring that public health is improving, or mobility and transport, is that on the up? What about the economy? We have to ensure that Europe, or Africa rather, as a continent can manage that. It's important first to assess what we have done, where we are, and then to move on, as I said, approach it humbly to try to get a common project off the ground. The climate, of course, is front and center, so you can't answer that problem in isolation. This is at least my impression. We need a long-term approach. And that might mean that certain investment has to be shifted, has to be redirected, because in the future we'll be facing different challenges. They won't be the challenges we're facing today. We have to be efficient. We have to come up with partnerships that really work.
I hope we'll come back, if we have time, to the dynamic involvement of China, the European promises, and whether this long-term planning capacity is political. For you as a politician, is it possible, the way politics works, to have this long-term vision and planning? Pondering this, I thought of the question of the water catchment basins, access to water resources, but also mobility. It seems to me that these river catchment basins, the Senegal River, for example, which goes through Guinea, Mali and Senegal, and which is now the focus of all sorts of conflicts between these three countries. But if we were to break through these territorial constraints, which don't really have any value when it comes to the issues at stake, we could come up with some very ambitious circularity mobility programs at continental level to address these issues. So do you think this kind of integrated Pan-African approach could be one of the solutions for the deployment of infrastructure that would be better for the environment? So, I mean, if you could use these rivers, for example, as a means of transport, wouldn't that be good for the African continent? How could this creative vision perhaps work hand in hand with politics?
Je vais revenir sur mon propos liminaire, c'est-à-dire...
Well, coming back to my introductory comment, it's a relatively recent development. For a long time, everybody was working in their own corner, in their own member state, in their own region or municipality, sort of cultivating their own garden, so to speak. And we've tried to build development step by step in a rather piecemeal basis. I mean, I don't want to call people's motives into question, but this has been done in a rather piecemeal way. And now we've got a new situation in our approach to the development of the world. There's only this recent, perhaps, political awareness of how interconnected we all are. So this may take some time. It is true that people's thinking is changing now. In the EU, the process of European integration, this was led by the economy gradually. Now we're raising different questions, questions about the role of nations, the European continent, about world governance. Now, of course, we're focusing on the pandemic, the climate and migration from a point of view of realizing that we can't respond individually. We can only solve these problems if we address them with some humility and with a sense of being in this together. This is something that is a responsibility of all of us. The pandemic will only be resolved when vaccines are accessible to everybody everywhere in the world. That's why I've talked a lot about the patent waiver. This will probably come up again in the round table later on. So these are quite new ways of going about things. And on your hydrographical basins approach, this has to be done with a new approach of thinking that we all have something in common. We can't just leave things up to the markets to regulate by themselves, as we used to think from the traditional liberal way of thinking. So without this change in thought paradigms, as it were, we can't address these problems. Today, I think, have to look at all the IPCC reports that have been coming out every quarter or so and understand that the world we want to build is going to be a new world. And in that context, perhaps Africa has an important, in fact, I'm sure Africa has an important role to play. So we have to have a new contemporary approach and start working for the future. And when we talk about relations between men and women, the way we work together, the way regions work together, this is going to be essential. We cannot address climate change. It's going to affect all policies, public and private.
Une grosse contrainte.
Yes, you've talked about something which is a major constraint. You mentioned the market. And there I hope that we'll be able to hear from Alice Usanazi on finance, or the potential financing of the infrastructure we need, how to mobilize investment, what investments can we make without the market. I think Alice Usanazi is not connected. So sorry about that. I'll turn straight to you, Connie Reuter, on urbanization. I was talking about a Pan-African approach, but maybe urban development is going to take us in that direction. In 30 years' time, we'll be experiencing region cities, one big conurbation going from Lagos to Abidjan, with all of the environmental problems that would entail that we were talking about just now, because if these cities development in the way they are in Europe, it's going to cause enormous effects on the environment.
I will continue in English. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to the Social Democratic Group of the European Parliament, to my friends and comrades Irache, Udo and Erik and others who mobilize every year on the Africa Week. Well, I'm not African, I'm European, but I have a particular responsibility now being the global coordinator of Progressive Alliance. For those who not immediately refer to Progressive Alliance, just to let you know, the Progressive Alliance has been created in 2013 as the global cooperation platform of social democratic and socialist parties worldwide. So although being European, through the Progressive Alliance, we work with the member and sister parties on all continents. And indeed, the question which is on the table here, which is a question of landscapes and development of sustainable cities, infrastructural deficits, it's a global question. Whether you are in Rio de Janeiro, whether you are in Santiago de Chile, whether you are in Ciudad de Mexico, or whether you go to Lagos, to Abidjan, to Kinshasa, Khartoum, or Mumbai, there are similarities. And I think it is very good, like Erik said it before, I think we as Europeans, in particular, ahead now of another EU-Africa summit, where you have a lot of great declarations, like in all summits, which are immediately forgotten once the summit is over, and which are not always translated in concrete policies. Perhaps now, if we understand that there is a need for humility, and also to understand where are the problems, and to find a balance between immediate problems that need to be resolved now and an anticipation to what will happen in the next 50 or 100 years. You said it in your introductory remarks. We will have in 100 years, one citizen of this globe will be African. Do we understand what it means? We will have the doubling of the population on the African continent. We will have a reduced demography in other parts, even Asia, also and in particular Europe. So do we really have the opportunity, do we take the necessary time to have an understanding of what were the mistakes of urbanization policies, also in Europe? Yeah? Look to Paris region, look to the banlieue. You solved a question like housing and you created new social problems. Infrastructure is there, electricity is there, water is there, but there is a big social problem behind. And I think this time we should not lose the opportunity really to invest in a strategy which is based on the lessons from the past and which in the same time is able to anticipate. Well, as a German social democrat, for sure, I always refer to Willy Brandt. And what I always find very shocking in a way is if you read the North-South report where Willy Brandt was the author 40 years ago, and you think the time we lost in 40 years, that means all what already was analyzed 40 years ago for development policies, including also urban development, and for the North-South relation, I think we missed many, many opportunities. So what's at stake? I think for all these great cities, well, we will see an evolution, and I was looking to some figures where will be the biggest African cities in 2100. Well, none of us will live anymore, I suppose, at that time. But well, Lagos is supposed to have a population for more than 80 million. So then we can understand what this means for access to water, for access to sanitation, for the question of electricity. And like our friend earlier said it with the example from Kenya, the question for mobility. Because what we have lost also is the possibility to understand, is the understanding that we need to promote the general interest and the public interest. There are a lot of initiatives in development policies which are nice, which are fine. And I was myself during 50 years Secretary General of an NGO network. But the general interest, take the example of the river that is crossing 3 or 4 countries. Who is taking the water off? Who will use it? Who will not be able to use it? How can we create this common understanding that there are common challenges, we need common answers? And I think it is very clear, at least for us in the Progressive Alliance, that at least whatever question you take out separately, it is a social question in the end. Because the question of transport is a social question with a gender dimension also, as we heard earlier. There is the question of safety in transports for women, which is also in Europe sometimes a problem, but in particular in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, it's a big problem and we do not speak about. So creating an infrastructure that is ensuring also security is an issue. How do we resolve the question of access to water? You said it in your introductory remark. There is 1/3 that has access to water, but we do not speak on the quality of water. And if you look, and let me finish by this, if you look at the time that it took to clean up the rivers also in Europe, we know that it's not just by coup de baguette magique that we will change it. There is a question of really identifying with humility the problems of today and anticipating what shall be the solutions and bringing the actors together to overcome these egoisms and to define a general and a common interest. And I think this is where we come to what is the essence of social democratic and socialist policies.
Je vais rester sur le mot d'égoïsme.
Well, I'll stick with that word, egoism. Listening to both of you, you're talking about this common approach, this kind of common global awareness, which has to be at the heart of what we do from now on. And while we're on that, perhaps I could venture an idea. Not saying this would be your idea, but when we talk about an infrastructure deficit, what could Europe's role be in this, bearing in mind the role Europe has historically played as a partner of Africa? Does Europe have some responsibility, a share in this? And would it not have an interest in this? So if we were going to consider that the backwardness, as it were, would to a certain degree be due to Europe, because Europe found it in its interest to keep people in a backward state in Africa. Is it still sustainable today? Clearly not, from what you have been saying in terms of this global awareness, this need for interoperability. But what can be done then if in the past Europe has perhaps been rather complacent about Africa's backwardness? How can we shift now to a fairer role for Europe?
Well, yes, I think I'd agree with you. If you look back over the history of Africa, we're all very aware of it. We don't have the time now to go back over the relationship between the continents of Europe and Africa, certainly certain member states and their relationship with Africa. What's happening now is that the European Union as a whole is starting to become aware of what is at stake for the continent of Africa. For a long time, there were a few member states doing this in isolation, but now we have all the countries making up the European Union doing just that, from whatever political group. I think there is a collective awareness coming to the fore, and that's important, particularly now when you're thinking about global governance. There is a position to be held, and I think that really requires Europe and European decision makers to determine what the EU wants to do, the continent of Europe. There's a debate to be had about that. Does Europe want to play a role in regulating the world? And indeed, on an international scale, we're far removed from that for the time being. I'm talking about all sorts of areas, security, governance, the economy, migration, transport. We'll come back to all of these things, I'm sure. But in terms of the way that we work, we have to review how we do things if we want global answers to these global issues. If you look at Mali, Burkina Faso, Ukraine, everything that's happening today, well, what about Europe? Can Europe resist the lure of the markets and the temptation in its relationship with Africa? I'd say potentially, yes. I mean, it hasn't previously for various institutional reasons, decision-making reasons, economic reasons, of course, but we could equip ourselves with that possibility. I mean, in policy you start by fixing the big issues and then you move on to the smaller ones. But now Europe is setting big targets linked to climate. So we have the Green Deal. But I would say that public policy seeking to resolve climate change hasn't yet met expectations. So this is precisely what the debate is about. And in Europe, we can't miss that boat if we want to take the lead, because earlier you said that Europe came into the continent of Africa and over 20 years they've come in. Well, China really has got there first, I would say. I mean, I often say who benefits from any crimes that take place? Well, imagine a situation today in the 21st century, the richest economy in the world has resources, but take them from some of the poorest in the world. And in terms of policy, we keep coming up with these false equivalencies. It's maybe not very elegant to put it this way, but I think today what's clear is that we are facing a joint endeavor, which is climate change, and we can no longer pretend that this is about public policy. We can't do this purely with public money. We need to seek partnerships, the private sector, but if we look for the private sector investment, then we have to understand what their targets are. You talked earlier about government money. Of course, that has to form part of the debate. What is a public good and what isn't? We have to consider policy. We have to determine what the bill is for these last 40 years that policy hasn't responded to. I mean, overall, across the board, we have to recognize that we have an obligation to provide answers in the decades to come. Well, we haven't given up trying to connect with Alice. Hopefully her connection will improve. Connie, on the same issue, the same question. Is Europe really an authentic actor? Are there biases in its relationship with Africa? Well, I'm not sure that we've really come to terms with our colonial past. When I travel around the world, if I touch down in an airport, the first thing I do is look to see who built it. Usually, it's either a European company or the Chinese. The French, they sold off some of their airports to the Chinese. So we have big pieces of infrastructure. These are often funded by European companies. They are behind them. So you don't only follow who done it, you have to follow the money as well. Currently, Europe is facing unprecedented competition. We had blocks through to 89, but we know that there might be conflict with Russia and Ukraine, hopefully.
Diplomatique, mais on a une compétition très très forte dans tous les.
We hope that the politicians will be able to avert that, but be it in Africa, in Asia, or in Latin America, we have to recognize that the Chinese are already there. So I'll give you an example. In Argentina, all of the ports are already owned by the Chinese. I mean, I won't give you a whole list, chapter and verse, but if you look at a map of Africa, look at the ports, look at the investment. It's not coming from Europe, it's coming from China. And we rightly criticize Europe's trade policy. There are various civic policies, NGOs, but nobody talks about China. And I think that's a mistake. I would say that there's an opportunity now to understand that, yes, Europe has been selfish. We've put together trade policies, partnerships in our own interests. That's no longer going to wash. So I'm not going to talk about a cultural revolution because that's something that saw a lot of lives lost in China. But a revolution, certainly, in terms of climate change, fighting climate change and the pandemic, it gives you an idea of the political momentum behind this and the fact that solidarity in the public good is coming back into fashion. And Eric, you were talking about this, and in the Progressive Alliance, we were talking about ensuring that patents were opened up to everybody to ensure that everyone around the world could be vaccinated. That has been hotly contested because we're protecting the standard via the patent. Now, we talk about partnerships between Europe and Africa, But we need specific policies to bear that out. The policies have to be in the interest of the continent of Africa and Europe. It has to be a general interest. And allow me to make this point, and it's an old chestnut, which is corruption. Some people talk about redistribution of wealth. People on the continent say, well, socialists, you're always banging on about corruption, but it's distribution of wealth, redistribution of wealth. I mean, you like it back home, but you call it corruption when we do it. Now, we have to be very cautious, of course, but we're counting on young people, the younger generation, to stand up and defend the general interest and also the idea of sound, good governance. And today, I think that we're facing massive, huge problems. We can't simply try to deal with this in isolation on our own. We have to find joint solutions. Transport, electricity shouldn't be privatized, should remain in public hands and be managed publicly. Sadly, Europe hasn't always led by example, but we are now backtracking somewhat. So I think if we learn our lessons, learn the lessons from the past, find the right people, we will find good examples. And to take transport problems of big cities, look at Europe, look at Bogota, for example, as an example. Well, thank you. Yes, you've given me the opportunity to touch on transport, and you also mentioned corruption. So maybe we can go back to Naomi Moira and hear an African perspective about all sorts of points that have come out of this discussion. Yes, bias in dealings with Africa. You mentioned corruption. I would like to hear from Naomi about that, but also to hear about these threats that we hear about from Europe. Europe is talking about the threat from China. So, Naomi, do you think, like others, that Africa should try to change things, ensure that they can save the day where China and Russia are coming in? What do you think is the best approach?
Yeah, thank you for that question and also the insights shared by other panelists. I think as an Africa, we are really in a tricky situation, especially as citizens who we feel that we are helpless when it comes to our leaders and the debt they take in terms of, or should I say, in the name of investing in infrastructure. So we've had an incident, for example, where Kenyans on Twitter were against the IMF debt to Kenyan. But as you can tell from that incident, nothing changed, that Kenya still got the loan. And so I think given the way maybe somebody who's not African sees the situation, is that there is development, but there is a dark side to that development. And for example, as a Kenyan, when I look at how much taxes I pay, they're even higher than most countries. I think it's even higher than most, I think definitely the United States and some European countries. We have some of the highest corruption scandals, but there is no accountability, right? And even I think development agencies have tried to put measures in place in order to curb corruption, but that has not really yielded a lot of results. And so I think as an African, I can conclude that it's a catch-22. Do we want development, and do we get in development at the expense of our future earnings in terms of now, for example, Kenya is highly overtaxed. And as we say, you can't overtax yourself out of debt. But that has fallen on deaf ears to our Kenyan government. And so, as I mentioned, it's a catch-22 where, yes, we have development, but with it comes the darker side of debt that we are unable to pay.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much indeed, Naomi. I'll give you perhaps 1 minute each, gentlemen, if you want to add a final word, starting with you, Eric Andrieux. Well, thank you. First of all, I'm very grateful to you for this debate, which sheds light on the issues. And there's certainly a lot for us to do as progressives. And as we've heard, I think that the pandemic and climate change together have fundamentally upset the apple cart and changed things completely. It's a moment that's shown that this liberal model we've been following for the last 40 years has not provided the correct response in geopolitical terms. So what does that mean? It means that at European level, we have come up with a recovery plan, several billions of euros. So we're going back to providing handouts, we're going back to ensuring that healthcare vaccinations are provided, and I think there are examples from around the world that show that this is all independent. We can't have this set in. So it's in time for a rethink, time for a rebalancing. It's no good going from a multipolar world where we don't recognize how important China is, for example. We have to recognize that each of us are important and are interdependent. We have to think about human rights, solidarity, about striking a balance. We heard about wealth, unacceptable inequality, poverty, solidarity, ensuring that we address the inequality gap here and elsewhere. So these are ideas that have to feed into everything we do, our political commitments. If we work with private players, well, I would say why not? But we should start by defining our policy first, determining what is in the public interest, in the public good, and that should occupy us in everything we do every day. But we've started the discussion. That's good. So we should talk before we wade into battle. It's certainly coming, but it is our responsibility to address our history and to ensure that values are right at the heart of the upcoming debate. Thank you very much.
We were speaking on the catch-22 situation, and yes, she's absolutely right. Once we have given the definition of a strategic project that is in the general interest, that the new generation is taking, well, the ownership of a development which can only be sustainable. And I think we have not outspoken the term, but sustainable development is the reply to the pandemic, is the reply to the question also of that transforming the urban landscapes. Everything is under this heading. And I think we break it down into policy steps. But the catch-22 will only be solved if we understand that we need sustainable investments in infrastructure, in electricity, in health infrastructure, in social infrastructure and everything. But this has also precondition. And the precondition to solve this catch-22, in my understanding, is the question of something which has been a huge movement some 10, 50 years ago, which will certainly come back, which is a popular movement on the question of the debt eradication. I think we will not continue to speak on investments and developments and partnerships with the African continent or other continents if we do not attack this crucial question, because if not, there is not enough margin de maneuver for really investment policies, because you need a combination of public investment and private capital under a value-driven political project, and I think Social Democrats are able to define this project. And it is not the question of which continent you are. We are united by values, and we are united by a political vision. And so this is now the work begins. It will be hard, and we need the next generation.
Merci, Reuter.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Reuter. Thank you all very much indeed for attending this discussion today. Sadly, we weren't able to talk about investment. That's unfortunate. I'm sure that we'll be able to address that at the next Africa Week, nor do we discuss digital. I think when it comes to infrastructure, there is a lot to consider from that point of view. But to summarize, I think we have focused on sustainability. If I were to sum up, I think it's important that we move to green infrastructure. So we have to operate in that arena. I think that's where this is going to happen. We need a global consciousness. We need a new relationship, something that is fairer, more equal between Europe and Africa. We need to ensure that any attempt to restore the old order that is less ethical can be headed off. But again, we have to move to a greener infrastructure. That might be an opportunity for the African continent itself to stand up, to use new technology. It will be an opportunity to shake things up and to rethink financing, for example. But from my point of view, it is a sector that deserves investment because it will help to solve many of the other issues we are facing. It will help marginalized populations, women, the indigenous population, those who are mainly affected by climate change. So thank you all very much indeed for your attendance. I will let you go, but I'll just tell you what is coming up. So between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. today, we have an online music performance. So live music from African music groups. And then from 3:30 to 5:30, we have a high-level political conference between the EU and Africa, interrogating the disparities of partnership towards a post-pandemic era. I'd remind you that as of tomorrow, you can attend the Communalis exhibition that I put together with the ULB, the Fab Lab, and you can also visit that online. There's a QR code on the Africa Week website.